Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I should say good evening, my friends. That's really the way I feel at this point in my life and at this point in the festival. My name's David Gordon. I've been with this festival for a long time, and one of my very favorite things to do is what I'm doing right now. And I really feel like I'm in a room full of friends. That's one of the great things about this festival. There's a sense of community here among the festival participants. Very few of our musicians can spend so much time in one place on a gig. It's way more than a gig. And it is for all of us, and I think it is for you as well. And many of you here I know by first name, and I find that just wonderful. I feel like I'm talking in a very relaxed situation, and I hope to keep it that way. I want to talk with you about the music that we're going to hear tonight. I grew up in a loving family where lots of music was played on LPs and on the radio, lots of good music, but not classical music. And it was symphonic repertoire that brought me into a love of what we call classical music. Long before I ever heard opera, long before I even knew who Bach was, I was listening to symphonies by Tchaikovsky and Brahms and Beethoven. And yes, I was listening to Stravinsky, including the big, nasty works that he wrote before the rather Baroque work that he wrote tonight. I remember listening to The Rite of Spring for the first time and having my ears thoroughly opened. So I am really happy to be at this concert tonight. I love Brahms Symphony No. 2, and I want to tell you about it and the two pieces that come before it. Before that, a couple of housekeeping announcements. I want to thank, as I always do, the folks at AMP 27. This is Access Monterey Peninsula, Channel 27. These lectures are broadcast live on the internet. They are rebroadcast again and again during the festival, and they're stored on the AMP 27 website permanently. You can archive, they're archived there. You can go and watch. If you've missed the lecture or something you didn't want to miss, you can see it online. We link to it also from our own website. Channel 27 is a video production facility that makes itself available to local nonprofits, government organizations, educational institutions. It's a really great, great organization. ampmedia.org. Yes? Okay. I'm going to. Is it easier to hear there? Yes. Okay. We just needed a little bit of treble. Okay. Treble. Is that easier? Okay. We're going to try that for a little while and see what happens. Thank you for asking. ampmedia.org is the URL. I just love these acronyms. ampmedia.org is the URL. Visit it ASAP. I also want to remind you about a new tradition that's now 4 years old. It's our Art of Music art raffle. Standing in the back is one of our loyal, cheerful, happy, zesty volunteers wearing a sparkly red apron. From that person, you can purchase a raffle ticket. The exhibit is in the Marjorie Evans Gallery in the upper patio, right next to our Bach Festival boutique. And you put your raffle ticket in the box right under the piece of art, the artwork that you want to win. More than 125 miniature artworks by regional artists, inspired by our beautiful region, the beautiful scenic region of Carmel and its vicinity, and also the colorful excitement of the Bach Festival itself. You can buy a ticket, you can visit the exhibit and buy a ticket through the end of the day on the 28th of July. The drawing will be on July the 30th, and you do not need to be present to win. I have been a winner, you can be a winner too. Let's talk about dancing for a minute, shall we? Dancing was very popular during the Baroque. Of course, the same could probably be said for just about any other era of history, including the present era. And dance music often inspired composers, not the least of whom was Johann Sebastian Bach. Although the influence of dance is most obvious in his suites, as we will hear tonight, for keyboard, his suites for orchestra, dance-like gestures and dance forms are present in Bach's work of every genre, including some of his sacred choral music. It was very common in the Baroque era to base a work of music on a recognizable dance form. Meter, beat, pulse, easily recognizable. But here, we are only concerned with the dance as it applies to his orchestral suites. In this case, composers like Bach and Handel wrote what we call stylized dances, which were intended for listening, but not for dancing. This means that the dances followed their particular stylistic norms, the beat, the meter, the tempo, the pulse, but they allowed for more musical elaboration and ornamentation than would have been possible when you were actually dancing on the floor. Johann Sebastian Bach composed a number of so-called orchestral suites. We call them that. He called them overtures. But only 4 of these have survived. The original full score for the one we're hearing tonight begins tonight's concert, Suite number 4 in D major. The full score has been lost, and musicologists have pieced it back together by the various individual instrumental parts, first violin, second violin, viola, and so forth. They've reconstructed it. Recent Bach scholarship seems to indicate that the orchestral suites originated not in his midlife in Köthen, where he was a musician to the princely court, but were actually the product of his last 27 years in Leipzig, where he was director of music for the city and director of music for several churches. The suite number 4 is scored for exactly the ensemble that he had at his disposal at a coffee house where they made music on Friday night. I love this. The Collegium Musicum. There were some students from the university, professors from the university, people from the town, and even some musicians from Bach's churches. And they met at Zimmermann's Coffee House every Friday night. It was a very big establishment in which concerts were given. In the summer, Zimmermann's moved to a garden, a candlelit garden outside the town walls. If you've ever had a beer in a beer garden in a German town in July or August on a moonlit night, it can be very special, and I think it would be a lot more special if Johann Sebastian Bach were there with his musicians. They gathered at Zimmermann's every Friday night to make music. And he had in that ensemble 3 oboes, a bassoon, strings, continuo, and sometimes trumpets. And they created quite a sound. This ensemble tonight, we believe, that is, this piece tonight, we believe, may have been premiered at Zimmermann's, as were several of his harpsichord concertos and other instrumental works during the time that he was in Leipzig writing music for churches. This was his primary outlet for writing secular music, instrumental music, concertos, and so forth, was Zimmermann's Coffee House. The orchestral suites of Bach all use traditional French dance forms. This dance suite idea traces its origin to the early Baroque period in France, most notably in the keyboard works of the celebrated harpsichordist, organist, composer, teacher François Couperin, who was just a little bit older than Bach. It is Couperin's basic organization of the short movements, their keys, their tempo relations, and so forth, that is the origin of the dance suite of Bach and Handel. Musically, all the 4 Bach suites that we have, there were probably more, but these 4 we have the music for. I always like to say parenthetically, keep in mind that probably nearly half of everything Bach wrote was lost after he died. That's a sobering thought, and it makes us, I hope, be even more grateful for the music that we still have. Musically, these 4 suites of Bach's share similar features. They all include an elaborate multi-part overture that is known as a French overture. It has very robust dotted rhythms. It begins slowly and grandly, moves into something that is more sparkly, and comes back to slow grandeur once again. When Mendelssohn in the 19th century played Bach suites on the piano for Goethe, Goethe closed his eyes at the French overture, this grand introduction to the piece, and said he imagined a great array of noble royal people coming grandly down a stairway. I encourage you to close your eyes, if you can, with these sparkly musicians on the stage. Close your eyes and imagine what you might see. The overture is followed by a number of stylized dance movements. They are meant to be listened to, but not danced to. There are two bourrées, which is a French quick dance in a duple meter, and then a gavotte, which is usually in 4 and begins on the third beat. 1, 2, and dum ba da 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 da. So the beat is not 1, 2, 3, 4, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how we recognize these various dance movements, by the beat patterns. There are two minuets, dum 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 dum, elegant dances in triple meter. The minuet was probably the most formal of the dance forms used in these musical stylized dances, and the minuet is the one that most successfully made it through into the age of Mozart and Haydn. They often had minuets as a movement of their symphonies. The final movement of this dance suite by Bach is not a dance. It has the delightful name Réjouissance, rejoicing, in which timpani and trumpets figure very prominently. No one could argue that in the hands of Johann Sebastian Bach, this orchestral suite, this form of a suite of little movements based on dance forms, reached the peak of perfection. The 4 orchestral suites are among Bach's most elegant and sublime creations, instrumentally, and we are featuring all 4 of them at various places on our festival this year because of that. So after hearing some real Baroque music, some real exemplary, wonderful Baroque music, we then hear a 20th century composer playing around with Baroque music. The Russian-born American composer Igor Stravinsky identified himself as an inventor of music. The novelty and power and elegance of Stravinsky's music won him worldwide fame before he was 30. And throughout his life, Stravinsky continued to surprise his admirers with transformations of his style that stimulated all kinds of controversy. Igor Fedorovich Stravinsky was born near St. Petersburg in 1882. His father was a star of the St. Petersburg Imperial Opera, but he expected young Igor to become a bureaucrat, a safer job, I guess. Igor dutifully finished a university law course, not a degree, a university law course, before he made the firm decision to become a musician. By this time, he was a very good amateur pianist. He was an occasional professional accompanist for instrumentalists and singers. And he was quite an enthusiast of avant-garde music from France and Germany, and a connoisseur of Italian, French, and Russian opera. He never attended a music conservatory, but studied extensively and privately with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, among other teachers. The great Russian impresario, Sergei Diaghilev, heard Stravinsky's works in St. Petersburg and invited Stravinsky to go to Paris, which was at that time becoming a hotbed of the arts. Diaghilev engaged Stravinsky to write music for ballets that Diaghilev was producing for his Ballet Russe, the Russian ballet in Paris. The first 3 ballets that Stravinsky wrote for Diaghilev totally scandalized the musical world and thereby brought Stravinsky to international fame. They were The Firebird in 1910, Petrushka in 1911, and The Rite of Spring in 1913. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a work so radical and so controversial that it famously provoked fistfights in the auditorium during the actual premiere concert by people who were disputing the relative value of the music they were hearing while they were hitting each other. And you know, I can imagine Stravinsky being really happy at this because at least people are noticing his music and reacting to it. This one piece of music transformed the way subsequent composers thought about rhythmic structure and it was largely responsible for Stravinsky's enduring reputation as a musical revolutionary who absolutely pushed the boundaries of musical design. This phase of his career, which is about the early 1900s to about 1920, was known as his Russian phase. He was bringing his own revolutionary musical tendencies from Russia to Paris. He was writing in a way that seemed to want to break all the molds and break down all the idols and create his own model. The work from this period, this early period, tended to make use of traditional music forms, but he used them in a totally innovative and exploratory way. Then follows what we call his neoclassical period. This is about 1920 to 1954. This is the middle of his life. And the works from this period tend to draw on older art forms. The concerto grosso, the fugue from the 18th century, early symphonies. They often paid tribute to the music of early masters. And the music we hear tonight is a transitional work that marks Stravinsky's entry into this neoclassical period. In the spring of 1919, Diaghilev suggested to Stravinsky that he write a ballet based on music by Pergolesi, an early Baroque composer. Stravinsky turned him down because he wasn't particularly fond of the small amount of Pergolesi's music that he knew. But Diaghilev dug up some little-known Pergolesi pieces from some libraries and museums in Italy and showed Stravinsky these manuscripts. And they caught Stravinsky's fancy, and he agreed to the idea. As I said, Pulcinella was a transitional work for Stravinsky. It was an important turning point. It led him into this neoclassical style, a new version of the old classical repertoire, in other words. It was characterized in part by the emulation of the late Baroque and early classical period. He drew on music of the time of Handel, Vivaldi, Bach, slightly later composers of Mozart and Haydn. But Pulcinella, he thought, was about Pergolesi. I say thought because we now know that some of those manuscripts were not actually by Pergolesi, but were by contemporaries of Pergolesi, but it was all Baroque music, and that's really the point. Stravinsky would later remark, Pulcinella was my discovery of the past, and it was the epiphany through which the whole of my late work became possible. In the case of Pulcinella, Stravinsky formed a pastiche from the works of Pergolesi, or as I say, those mistakenly attributed to Pergolesi at the time that Stravinsky was writing. These works he was drawing on were from disparate genres like trio sonatas and suites and opera arias. They were adapted by Stravinsky through various musical means such as lengthening, shortening, cutting, adding new music, changing harmonies, overlaying his own rhythms over the rhythms that were already there. If you look at the score and you know the original music, parenthetically, I recorded the full Pulcinella ballet with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra years ago, and on that CD is some of the original music that Stravinsky used. If you look at the original scores and Stravinsky's scores, you can see the original score inside Stravinsky's score. You can see the original notes in there. Mostly he's added stuff to it, and it'll occasionally cut a beat out or put an extra beat in. Unlike his earlier ballets, the three bad big ones, Petrushka, Firebird, and Rite of Spring, which were characterized by huge orchestras and innovative, avant-garde pounding rhythms and unusual, exciting things, Pulcinella is relatively simple and sparse. The original ballet was 20 movements, scored for an orchestra of 33, plus 3 vocal soloists. And it sticks mostly to rhythmic patterns established in the 18th century. But even though Stravinsky used Pergolesi's melodies and his bass lines with little change, he still manages to put his own unmistakable stamp on the ballet through his use of modern harmonies and occasional subtle rhythmic modifications. The work was premiered in 1920 at the Paris Opera. The choreographer was the great Léonie de Massine, and get this, the sets and the costumes were designed by Pablo Picasso. Wouldn't you like to have been at that concert? The inspiration for the ballet Pulcinella, the actual story of which was written by Leonid Massin, the choreographer, was Commedia dell'arte, which is Italian improvised theater, and it's stock characters. Commedia dell'arte was extremely popular in the 19th century, although it was well known both before and after its heyday. The character Pulcinella is known in puppet shows as Punch. And he's a servant. He's a comically sad character, often portrayed as mute and helpless. The whole ballet is a depiction of this Pulcinella, Harlequino, Colombina, all these stock figures of the Italian Commedia dell'arte. You can hear a little bit of that flavor even in the instrumental music. So it premiered to great success in 1920 at the Paris Opera. And in 1922, Stravinsky, smart fellow that he was, created an orchestral suite that is suitable for concert performance. He reduced the number of movements from 20 to 11. He eliminated the vocal solos. He slightly reduced the size of the orchestra. This Pulcinella suite by Stravinsky was premiered by the Boston Symphony in 1922, and this is the music we hear tonight. Stravinsky left Paris and settled in Hollywood. He spent more time living in Los Angeles than in any other city of the world. He became a naturalized United States citizen in 1945. In 1969, he moved to the Essex House Hotel in New York, where he lived until his death in 1971 at age 88. Igor Stravinsky has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and in 1987, he was posthumously awarded a Grammy for a Lifetime Achievement in Music. That brings us to the other classicist, a man who loved the 18th century, Johannes Brahms. He was born in 1833 in Hamburg, but spent most of his life as a resident of Vienna, and he died there in 1897. Brahms' First Symphony was a deadly serious affair that took him 22 years to complete. He composed it in agonized bursts of activity that spanned the years from 1854 all the way to 1876, putting it away now and then to have prolonged bouts of existential angst and hand-wringing over whether he would ever write a symphony that would be able to match his hero, Beethoven. He said, "You have no idea how it is for the likes of us to feel the tread of a giant like him behind us." He despaired that he would ever be good enough to publish a symphony. What he finally produced in 1877 was a giant slab of C minor granite that has a well-earned place in the orchestral repertory, but it's a symphony that has just a whiff of self-conscious pretentiousness to it, the sound of a young man sensing himself in a room full of artistic giants and nervously proclaiming a confidence that he perhaps didn't already feel. This insecurity is most detectable in Symphony No. 1's opening, which barges in the door with hammering Sturm und Drang in C minor. After he cleared this monumental 22-year hurdle, the Second Symphony popped out of him almost like a gasp of relief. The Symphony No. 2 was composed the year after he finished Symphony No. 1. He spent the summer at the Wörthersee in Österreich, in Austria. If anyone's ever been to the Wörthersee in the summer when the weather is nice, it's very easy to understand how you would feel in the mood for writing a symphony or doing just about anything else creative. Brahms led his friends down the garden path, however, with this symphony. He wrote to his publisher. Of course, another sidebar, let's remember that Brahms had a well-known streak of melancholy. We hear it in his music. His friends saw it in him. He writes to Simrock, his publisher, "I've written a symphony. It's the saddest music I have ever written. I don't think you will be able to bear it. I think we should drape the score in black so that it is in mourning when the symphony is published." Well, the fact is, it's the happiest, sprightliest music he ever wrote. And I think the point here is that the music is so charmingly happy that even Brahms made a joke about it himself. It's a lovely, bright, energetic piece of music. Brahms was a classicist. He revered the musical structures of the 18th century, and he sought to bring them into his music and into the 19th century. And thus, in the Second Symphony, Brahms preserves the structural principles of the classical symphony coming from Mozart and Haydn, in which two lively outer movements frame a slow second movement and a kind of bright, fun scherzo third movement. The premiere was given on December 30th, 1877, in Vienna, under the baton of Hans Richter. It has been said of Brahms Symphony No. 2 that Mozartian blood flows in its veins. Edward Newman said that. There's certainly no doubt that this is one of the great affirmative finale endings in all of symphonic repertoire. The ending of this symphony, while you're... it's perhaps one of the greatest symphony finales ever written. It's bright, lovely, energetic. It brings the whole thing to this enormous, crashing, happy close. Where the first symphony was agonized, the second is a warm spring breeze. The burnished woodwinds under the sweet violins. And the work that it is most often compared to is the Sixth Symphony of Beethoven, the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven. An interesting aspect of our performance tonight is that during the time that this symphony was premiered, the brass instruments were being developed in the 19th century. During the time that Brahms was composing and all the other mid-19th century composers, brass instruments were being improved, valves were being added, various experiments were being made about the size of the bore of the instrument, that is the hole in the middle of the trumpet or the trombone. We are experimenting tonight with the kind of brass instruments that Brahms stated that he wanted. He deliberately wanted the old-fashioned brass instruments at this point in his writing, and he sets it out quite exactly how big he wants the orchestra to be, what kind of trumpets, what kind of horns he wants, what kind of trombones and that sort of thing. We are using tonight the kind of instruments that would have been available to Brahms in 1877. They are a little bit different from the modern horns. Our flute players are also playing with wooden joints at the beginning of their flutes, which give them a bit of an older sound. These instruments are still manageable because some of the older brass instruments are pretty ornery. These instruments are still manageable, but they give the music a different flavor. They give it a certain different tang. And I think the effect is very lovely. It's a very subtle and minor effect, and you probably will find that the instruments look more differently than they sound. But we're experimenting with this, and it is, we believe, at least on the West Coast, the first period instrument performance of the Brahms Symphony No. 2. And we're kind of excited about that. I've been enjoying watching this program coming together. We called it Music of Dance because of the dance references in the stylized movements in the Bach suite. The Stravinsky was written to be danced to, and the Brahms Symphony makes your toes tap and made Brahms' friends dance with joy because he actually wrote a happy piece of music. So I commend this concert to you. I remind you of my friend with the red apron back there who would be glad to sell you a raffle ticket. And I commend that exhibit up there to you as well. If you go up to hear the Tower Brass now, you're just a few steps from the art of music. And then we have the art of music in the concert hall at 8 o'clock. Thank you so much. I look forward to a great evening with you. Thank you.